Hello and welcome back, and yes, it's time for another SSD review. However, today I'm going to talk about an SSD that I've got genuinely conflicting emotions about. When I talk about a lot of the SSDs here on the channel that I've covered in the last few weeks, as all of the brands have suddenly shoved out all of their PCIe Gen 4 M.2 NVMe SSDs, it's got to be said that one of them, this one in particular, let's be honest, is one that has genuinely left me kind of wondering how and why and the decisions behind it. This is the Crucial P5 Plus. Now, this is from Crucial, in other words, Micron. And let's be honest, not only are Crucial one of the biggest names in there when it comes to the likes of memory, and again, along with Corsair, but Micron and their work behind NAND in SSDs is pretty much universally accepted as the go-to outside of in-house production. Now, lots of brands when it comes to, like, we talk about Firecuda a great deal on the channel, and lots of other ones where motherboard brands like MSI and Gigabyte have jumped on the SSD bandwagon. They're all taking advantage of that Micron NAND inside there. Now, of course, this does as well. It'd be madness if it didn't. But there's lots of stuff about this SSD which, on the face of it, you think is very, very good, such as the NAND being 176 layer, which we'll talk about. The fact that it's got an in-house controller, something that we're going to talk about later on. These are things that we are used to as big booms for any brand when it comes to solid-state drives. But at the same time, the results and what we're seeing on the spec sheets don't necessarily line up for me as something where I look at and go, whoa. And in fact, I've seen other brands take advantage of some of the hardware and the production at the manufacturing, research and development level from Micron and indeed Crucial, let's be honest, and do slightly better things with it, hence my mixed feelings. But let's crack on. At the second half of this video, we're going to be doing all of our testing, AS, ATO, Crystal Disk, AJA, you name it, we're doing it at the end of the video. But for now, let's talk about the specifications and about this drive. Now, currently arrives in three capacities, a 500 gig, a 1 TB and a 2 TB. As you can rightly point out there, this is the 500 gig model there. Now that's important because later on when we do our specifications, we're going to have to keep an eye on the benchmarks and keep them relative to the 500 gig. So we will talk about that later on. But the 500 gig knocking around for about 80 to 100 quid, depending on whether you buy direct from Crucial or third-party websites. And the 1 TB at 160 and the 2 TB at 360, it's actually surprisingly affordable, particularly that 2 TB model. As you scale into the larger capacities, you will notice that the Crucial P5 Plus is arguably one of the most affordable PCIe M.2 NVMe SSDs currently available in the market. Indeed, it is supported by the majority of PC rigs, and again with backwards compatibility into PCIe Gen 3, of course, but of course with PCIe Gen 4 M.2 and indeed PCIe Gen 4 lanes. Equipped motherboards becoming a great deal more affordable. You can pick up some for 70 to 80 pounds now. A lot of people are looking at these more affordable SSDs and wondering, maybe. And on top of that, with consoles like the PS5, and yes, we've already committed tests on this, 3 barrages of testers with this SSD, and it worked in the PS5 in that current beta M.2 SSD upgrade, and it ran the games pretty much faultlessly, although there was one game without ruining my video that it did hit a few bumps along the way. So again, fairly decent SSD to be contending with here. Now, as mentioned, a lot of this drive is in-house production, and one of those is the controller on board there. The controller is Crucial's own NVMe architecture controller there. If we bring that up, and it does leverage a lot of lower power and heat management internally. There is the Crucial NVMe there on camera. Let's do the thumbnail. And on there, it's only 500 gig, and the back there has got no NAND there on there. If we remove that label very gingerly from there, we will be leaving the label on, but using a big old heatsink during our testing, we can have a good look at that controller inside there. Let's get that there just on screen. That controller, if you just make it out, that is our Micron controller there. Now, again, on the face of it, in-house controllers, we've looked at Samsung, we've looked at WD, we've looked at all of these vendors that rather than going to Phison, which nearly everyone has done with the E16 and the E18 controller, they kept it in-house. and to mixed results, something again I will touch on. But alongside that, there is of course the NAND. Now, one of the really impressive parts about this is this NVMe SSD arrives with 176 layer NAND on board. There's only like 2 or 3 SSD vendors at PCIe Gen 4 M.2 at 2280 length that are taking advantage of 176 layer NAND. 176 layer NAND is great for performance, but it's also great for storage capacity and endurance as well, which is something we're going to touch on in just a moment. I know I keep saying that, but I am getting there. So again, great choice of 3D TLC NAND inside this SSD, and of course that's Micron NAND in-house. It also arrives with DDR4 memory, but low power DDR4 memory, low power consumption I should add. So LPDDR4 SD RAM, and that arrives at 512, 1 gig and 2 gig respective to the 500 gig, 1 TB and 2 TB SSD. So again, they're able to take advantage of what is largely the standard of SSD memory right now. Also takes advantage of revision 1.4 NVMe. So again, you're taking, it's going to be great for the majority of modern motherboards that are equipped to 1.4 right now. And performance, this is where I was really surprised, because in some ways, this is a great SSD in performance, particularly this one, this 500 gig. I'm used to, up until this point, in all of my 500 gig reviews for these, and 500 gig, for all of its great economy, you lose a little bit in capacity, but what's worse is nearly all, and I include WD, I include Samsung, I include Fukuda, I include Sprint, I include all of them in this. At the 500 gig model, the right performance is pants. The majority of them, I think the worst I've seen is like 2,400 megabytes per second. Some even going lower than that at the kind of early gen PCIe4. And even those top tier in-house controller ones from WD and Seagate, WD and Samsung, those lowest tier capacity drives at 500 gig and even 250 gig have got particularly bad write performance at the 500 gig model. This, on the other hand, has 4,000 megabytes per second sequential write on the 500 gig model, which is particularly high for a 500 gig model PCIe Gen 4 SSD. Now, in terms of read, which let's face it, when it comes to gaming with big block data, so sequential being quite important, this has a reported 6,600 megabytes per second, and that applies to the 500 gig, the 1 TB and the 2 TB, which I found really surprising. Given this isn't the oldest drive right now and was released and marketed a large amount of time after WD and Samsung released theirs at the end of 2020, even Sprint and MSI and Gigabyte with the 7000S, all of these SSDs arrived largely before this one. They all arrived with 7,000 and in some cases more than that sequential read. But this, with an in-house controller and 176 layer NAND, arrives at 6,600, which is either them being stupendously honest and everyone else is lying, or it's not as great as one would assume with that kind of architecture. An in-house controller, 176 layer 3D TLC NAND, PCIe, NVMe 1.4 revision. I'm just a little surprised. Now, yes, it's more affordable than the other, so clearly economies have taken place, and the drive is based around a low power consumption and therefore low heat and, lifespan architecture, but still, it's weird that it doesn't hit the 7,000. I know it's not much, it's only 400 meg, but still, it seems really odd that that's the case. Of course, sequential write goes up to 500,000 megabytes per second on both the 1 and the 2 TB, which is great. But again, a lot of the other brands are going higher than that with a very similar architecture, which I find quite strange. Now, in terms of IOPS, again, the IOPS are good, but they're not out of this world. At the 500 gig, it's 360,000 over 700,000. And again, that's read-write respectively. And again, at the 1 TB, 630 over 700, and then 720 over 700. Good IOPS figures. But WD, Black, Samsung 980 Pro, Fukuda 530, they're all breaking into the millions in their IOPS there, in read and write at these larger capacities at the very least. And the Seagate particularly has the same 1763 TLC NAND, which goes even further later on when we notice that in terms of endurance, and again, we're not going to look at the MTBF, I'm not going to be bothered with that, but we are going to look at the terabytes written, but more precisely, the drive writes per day, because terabytes written scales to individual drives, and I'm sure it's been on screen. With drive writes per day, this is rated at 0.3 drive writes per day. That means for every terabyte for its perfect maintenance and performance, they don't suggest that you write more than 300 gigabytes to the drive per day if it's out of every terabyte. Now, on the 500 gig model, that corresponds to 300 terabytes written, but that 0.3 drive writes per day on this is lower than I thought it would be. I'm genuinely surprised because one, of its low power architecture, and it is a very competent controller, and also because of that 176 layer NAND. Now, to put that into perspective, yes, the WD Black and the Samsung 980 Pro have both got 0.3 drive writes per day, but nearly every other drive out there using Micron's own NAND and the Firezone E16 or E18 controller have either got 0.38 drive writes per day, or in the case of the FireCuda and a couple of others, I think the GAMX X70 as well, some of these are cracking on for 0.7 and even higher, 0.8 in some cases, in the more bulky equivalents, drive writes per day. How is their endurance, more than double that of this with an in-house controller, low power architecture, and 176 layer NAND? And that's what I mean about mixed feelings about this SSD. I think in terms of its price point, particularly of course as you go towards the higher end of the capacity, it's very, very impressive, and it's very widely available from Crucial themselves and numerous other websites. But there's something about the architecture of that endurance and the peaks of its performance which I find very difficult to comprehend given its architecture there. And particularly when we've looked at so many SSDs right now, with so many brands because of the pandemic and hardware shortages and semiconductor shortages, and all those kind of cheer as well, that have affected the SSD market for all of these peak PCIe4 x4 M.2 NVMe SSDs, all to be released on the market with the barring exception of a few, all arriving in the same 2.5-3 month period, and summer as well, where generally sales are a lot lower. So I think not only would I have expected this SSD to have arrived last year alongside the Samsung and the WD Black to make more of an impact, to really show off its affordability versus return, but now it is in danger of being largely swamped and lost in the noise of bigger, bolder SSDs that are using their own proprietary tech. So for now, let's get this drive into the test machine. Let's see if one, it can live up to its promises, or hopefully exceed them notably. So let's get that in the machine. Again, I'll mention it in the review, but it's a 6-core 11th gen i5 processor. We're running 16 gig of DDR4 memory. This drive is going to be running as a secondary with the primary OS Windows 10 Pro running from a SATA Seagate SSD. So all of the tests are going to be running on this, independent of the OS, in a dedicated PCIe Gen 4x4 slot. Let's get this drive in the machine. Right, so we're on to the test machine and we have connected our drive. It's taking advantage of PCIe 4x4, and on top of that we are utilising NVMe Express 1.4 as the standard revision there. We've already attached the drive. I've mounted it already as its own distinct volume. We're using the test machine as mentioned, our 11th gen i5 sitting right there, and 16 gig. It's using embedded graphics but no graphics card, which will play its part during our testing later on. And of course we're using Windows 10 Pro here based on a SATA SSD. If we go into the test settings there, we're taking advantage of a 1TB Seagate FireCuda SATA and the separate disk here being our Crucial P5 Plus. Now, some of you may have noticed this drive is running a little hot there. It normally would be a little lower than that. I've done some preliminary kind of authentication testing there just to make sure the drive is communicating correctly. Hence that spiked, but it will go down. But for now, let's go ahead and go into our testing. Now, before we go any further, it's worth highlighting that I am using OBS for today's video to do the recording, which will unfortunately impact a lot of the recording. I could use an external PCIe or HDMI capture card, but I'm already utilizing it for a bevy of PS5 testing right now. So in order to make sure that the OBS does not affect the quality of our results, if I open AJA, for example, I am going to perform all the testing and then bring you guys back. I'm going to leave 1 minute between each test for the SSD to cool down, just 1 minute. And with all of our tests, a lot of this testing should take around about 25 minutes. So I'm going to bring you guys back in after the testing is done. We're going to be using AJA, as you see here on screen. We're also going to be using Atto Disk Benchmark. Sorry, the screen keeps going black. That's just when we're opening up something that needs user authentication, like an admin user. We're going to be using Atto there, looking at IOPS, and we're going to use 3 different file type sizes. We're also going to be taking advantage of Crystal Disk Mark 8, and in that we're going to use 3 separate test sizes with that. 1 gig and I believe 1 gig, 4 gig and 16 gig. And then after that we're going to be using AS SSD benchmark, and from here we're going to run a 1, a 3 and a 5 gig test file, all of which on that crucial SSD right there. But as you can see, with OBS running here, if I try to do the screen recording, if I try to do a bench test of this SSD like so, we're getting way less than we should have there. So in order, and again, we should really be looking at the graph, something we'll talk about later on, but for now, what I'm going to do is fast forward to the completion of all of these tests and go through all the results with you one by one to see if the crucial P5 Plus is living up to its promises or exceeding them, or worse, not hitting them at all. Look at that temperature rise already there. But for now, let's make our way into all of the tests. Okay, so we've got our test results. We've gone through all of them. I've taken lots of pictures there for the blog. Mostly okay, although there are a few things that I think are worth touching on. Again, let's crack on straight with it. The first thing that I was kind of surprised by was just how hot this drive runs. If you have a look here, this is a graph of the activity of the drive with periodic auto refresh there on the stats. As you can see, it ran particularly hot. Now, we are using the Elutang heatsink, the one we've used for the other videos. The only other heatsink we've ever used was the Sabrent, but only with Sabrent drives. But yeah, this did run a little bit hot, and even now, if we refresh, it's still sitting at the 50 there. We ended our testing not very long ago, about 2 minutes ago, and as you can see, it's still ebbing there at 50. So let's move on, moving forward. Let's go into our test. Firstly, probably the easiest to read, let's go for the Crystal Disk. And with the Crystal Disks there, as you can see, the 1 gig there being a much smaller test pattern file, the read wasn't fantastic if I'm honest, but it's made up for in the larger files, and again, that's what sequential is about. And again, if we go onto Crucial's own little spec sheet there, we make our way in. As you can see, they are reported there at the bottom in terms of performance. That is what we're looking at there. So if we move that, let's get rid of that on the side there. They're suggesting that the 500 gig model should be clocking in maximum at 6600 over 4000 megabytes per second there. And as you can see, if we have a look at this SSD a little bit, we can see that with the exception of the 1 gig, which is kind of a kind of breaking of the rule there, we can see that at the 16 gig file, because it's sequential, lovely big file there, we cracked through 6600 there, and even the write there exceeding their recommended, or at least their maximum, by well over 400 megabytes per second. And again, consistently, the write was higher in all 3 tests. In mixed performance, slightly different there, but again, we can see there that that isn't something we're going to have to touch on later on when we see Atto, which gives us a better understanding there. Now, bear in mind, although we are seeing 4K IOPS there, and the 4K IOPS reported here on screen are less than what the brand says, you have to bear in mind that they do not factor it on these massive files here. So again, we're not going to be too argumentative on that. So, but for the most part, I'd say these are good, even though they're not hugely indicative of real-world utilization. If we come out of them there, we can make our way into the next test, which was Atto. And again, Atto, 3 different file types there. Let's move out of IOPS and into traditional read-write. And if we go through, if we look at the write performance of the 256 megabyte files, that's a quarter of a gig, it peaked there at write at around about 4140. And again, that's pretty consistent across all of them. There's a slight peak there of 4.15. at the 1 gig file, and at the 4 gig file there, it's kind of a little bit more all over the place at but 4,170 or 4.17 gigabytes. Now in read, we did hit some heights there of getting close to the 6 gig, but it never went into 6,000 megabytes per second, peaking at 5,890 over here at the quarter of a gig file, and again getting into that 5,900 there with the largest file, unsurprisingly, but again didn't crack into the 6 gigabyte per second mark. In terms of IOPS, if we look between them again, you have to bear in mind the file size that we are dealing with here. They're pretty good for, you know, this kind of file size, but again, not out of this world fantastic. It's worth highlighting at the end. I do want to talk a little bit about the Fire CUDA because I think it is very relevant to this discussion, but we'll touch on that in just a moment. If we come out of Atto and go into ASS disk benchmark, we can see a 1 gig, a 3 gig and a 5 gig test file there. And again, none of these were conducted with OBS recording that we're using now to go through the results, so don't worry, that's not a factor. AS disk benchmark is always a little bit stricter in its results. It's always generally a marked 10 to 15% less than what we see from the likes of Crystal Disk. But even then, these are kind of what I would expect relative to the others. Nice numbers, but not breathtaking numbers, which I will show you an example of in just a moment at a similar price point. But last thing was AJA. AJA, we couldn't run concurrent sessions, so we had to take a few screen grabs of that. But if we head in to all of those, we're able to see, opening them all up, bring them all on screen, that if we look at the performance of each here, this is utilizing a 16 gigabyte test file. It peaked at 4,900. Again, with AJA, these are reversed, so you can ignore that. In the scenario of the direction that AJA uses, this is actually read and this is write, but they're looking at it the other way around. So the drive read was 4,900, not read, write, I should say. And in terms of the other one, it's 5,300 there. So again, all right, but not like earth-shattering. The same goes when we go into the other stats there. It's quite consistent, I will give it that. It maintains a good line, and you can see the average line there throughout. But again, the performance there, not like when I compare it to some other drives shortly, you'll see what I mean there. But again, it maintained that line of 4,900 and 5,003 or 5,400 throughout all the testing there. So if we come out of those, let's take a little look why I'm bringing up the case of the Fire CUDA 530. Now, let's keep it straightforward. Let's go back into the Crystal Disk. So if we bring those up there, bring all three up, nice and straightforward, and we'll keep them on this side of the screen. And we're just going to look at the top two stats there. So we're looking through, let's put them into some sort of semblance of an order. And as you can see there, between the three of them, with 16 gig, 4 gig, 1 gig, what those stats are. Now, if we head into the Fire CUDA, and again, this is a 500 gig drive using 176 layer 3D TLC NAND and the Phison controller, and we open these up, we can see at the 1 gig level, so again, it's coming out there, we compare that against that one in the middle, 6,500 versus 7. The write was less. As mentioned, the 500 gig models generally are noticeably lower, but even the mixed performance, the 4K performance, even the IOPS, everything, with the exception of a few bits with larger R&D, are better on that drive. Now, it's not just that. If we look at the 16 gig file and compare it here, we can see again, this drive at 6.6, this one at 7,000. The write was lower as expected, but in almost every other regard, the Seagate Fire CUDA was better. Yes, it's a much more expensive drive, but not that much more. And again, given that they're both using the same NAND, the same priority and control, I'm very surprised that that in-house controller on their Pro Series drive was not breaking barriers as much as I would have assumed it would. And again, that applies to pretty much all of these tests. If we look at AJA, it still is higher. If we look at the Crystal Disk, we look at all of these results. In almost every regard, this drive just outperformed it at the 500 gig capacity level. And this is what I was talking about at the beginning of the video about my mixed feelings, because in of itself, this is a good SSD. Crucial have made a very good SSD here that brings affordable PCIe M.2 NVMe storage to home and prosumers. However, if this had been released 6 to 8 months ago, I'd be a lot more impressed. And now, with far more SSDs on the market utilizing very similar architecture to this drive, case in point, let's go for the Corsair. If we look at a lot of these drives, they are exceeding it consistently. They are breaking barriers. There's lots of other SSDs out there to choose these days, and right now this drive feels like it should have come sooner, and the fact that it hasn't only highlights how much it is kind of coasting on a lot of its branding and not enough on its throughput and performance currently in summer autumn 2021. But it's still a good SSD, and if you do see it at a good price, or you're running a PCIe rig, PCIe Gen 4 rig, and perhaps you're using like a quad-core mid-range processor, you've got 8 gig of memory, maybe you're running a laptop that's never going to peak 6,600, you're not running a high-end system that's going to break these, then why go for the more expensive SSDs that you're never going to hope to hit 7,000? Go for an SSD like this, which is more affordable, and I would argue still has great IOPS, great brand reliability, and I've got to say, for a low power SSD, even though it did run a little hot with the temperature there, as you see, still, ebbing along at a marketable high. It didn't consume as much power as some of the more aggressive ones we've used earlier, and a lot of that is down to that memory, but of course there are other parts of the architecture in that Micron in-house controller too. If you've enjoyed this review, click like. There should be a link to the full written review and all of the examples today over on NAS Compares. If it's not live already, it'll be live very soon. And of course, I've got more SSD reviews to go, along with network attached storage, along with Thunderbolt and more here on the channel. Do take advantage of the free advice over on NAS Compares, completely free network and data storage advice for you, your home, your business, whatever. We don't do anything with your email. It's genuinely unbiased and free advice given by two humans, me and Eddie the web guy. It might take us an extra day or so to reply, but we answer everyone, and there are donate buttons, but you can ignore them if you choose. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.